Welcome back. Local dispatchers receive nearly 1,800 calls a day for people reporting emergencies. That means more than 600,000 calls to Sarasota County's Emergency Operations Center every year. But some of those calls can be avoided as people may call 911 for non-urgent issues. Joining us now are Misty Elmore and Mandy Lorenz, both 911 call center supervisors for the city of Northport. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Now, I have a question for you guys. Do people claim they have an emergency, but then you arrive and there's something else that is happening? Misty, you can answer that if you'd like.
Yes, they do. They don't understand exactly what an emergency is, and to them it may be an emergency. And then when the officers get there, it is not.
And how often is this happening when you guys get these phone calls, Mandy?
I would say daily. You know, people don't know exactly sometimes what an emergency is, or you know, that they don't necessarily have an emergency.
Okay, and are there any type of laws or statutes, any types of kind of punishment that can be put in place or that is in place for abusing the 911 line number?
I believe there's a charge for misuse of 911. I'm not educated on that side of the law, but yes, there is that charge that they can use for those types of calls.
Okay, and Misty, I have an article here out of Atlanta. A man was banned from calling 911 after making 100+ calls. Does this sound like something familiar to you? And is it something that you guys see frequently at your center?
Absolutely. You have certain people that will call 911 over and over and over again. Even if the call is delayed and an officer doesn't get there within a timely manner, they'll call 911 instead of our administrative line to see how much longer it's going to take.
Okay, and Mandy, when you get these types of calls, specifically our reporter Taylor mentioned somebody calling about her son not wanting to go to school, and you would think that that wouldn't necessarily be an emergency in that type of situation, but how do you respond to that? Because as you mentioned, to those people, that might be an emergency for them.
Exactly, and we never want to deter someone from calling 911. So in that instance, we would take the call just like we would take any other call. And then the officers would educate them on, you know, what line that they should be using.
And what is that kind of conversation like when you pick up the phone and they say something that might not be your typical ordinary emergency?
You know, we have our policies and procedures, standard questions we ask on different types of calls. So it would be just like any other call. The dispatcher would get that information, put it into the call for service, and an officer would go out there.
All right, thank you, ladies. Well, our conversation continues. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion about the number of phony 911 calls to our local dispatchers here on the Suncoast and how they can affect true emergencies. Joining us now are Misty Elmore and Mandy Lorenz, both 911 call center supervisors for the city of Northport. And thank you, ladies, for joining us. My next question. You know, here on the Suncoast, we have a large population of seniors, especially during the winter months when we have snowbirds visiting. How does this play any role into what type of calls are coming in to your dispatch line?
You know, we do get a lot of calls where someone might have fallen and needs, you know, assistance with that. Or a lot of times our elderly are quite easily scammed. So we get quite a few of those types of calls. Those aren't necessarily going to be emergencies, though. You know, that would be something more of a non-emergency. If they have fallen, then of course that's a different story. That would be a 911.
Right. And Misty, when it comes to children, how do you guys respond to those types of situations?
If a child calls, there's different ways that, you know, procedures we handle with a child, and you know, we address them by name, we talk to them. They're actually more calm than most adults because they don't understand that what they're calling about is an emergency. It's just a conversation for them. So we're able to get actually a lot of information from a child caller.
Okay.
And a lot of them, they translate for, you know, non-speaking citizens.
Right. Okay. And so I can imagine also sometimes if you were to get an emergency call from a child, that could be potentially difficult to emotionally handle. How do you guys handle that emotional side when it comes to any emergency, whether it is a child or someone who is having some sort of life-threatening incident?
Each dispatcher is different, you know, but we're all trained, you know, to take that call and to get it entered as quickly as possible. And then a particular dispatcher might just need to get up and walk around for a few minutes, you know, and just kind of de-stress, as opposed to another dispatcher might just go on to the next call. So it's all in how you are able to deal with that type of situation.
Certainly. Well, Misty, let's talk about what happens during a hurricane. We saw last year during Hurricane Irma, even emergency responders were on lockdown after 45 miles per hour winds were sustained. What is the typical protocol when someone calls with an emergency in that type of situation?
It depends on the emergency. With the Northport Police Department, we are police dispatch only. So if it's a fire call or an EMS call, which is a medical, we would transfer them to Sarasota County. And of course, they would follow their procedures. But we enter calls for service and we tell the police officers, we have a call, but they're not going to respond.
Okay. And how do you differ from Sarasota County Dispatch? You mentioned that you're different because you're different entities. And how does that go about?
Right. Well, as far as the Sheriff's Office and police, similar calls for crimes in progress. But we do not do emergency medical dispatch. That's why they're the public safety answering point. Any 911 call goes to them first, and then they filter out where that goes, whether it's 911, fire, emergency medical dispatching, or police. So they just filter it.
All right, thank you so much. Well, we are just getting warmed up. Our conversation on 911 calls will continue after a quick break. Welcome back. We're talking about the importance of calling 911 in a true emergency. Misty Elmore and Mandy Lorenz, both 911 call center supervisors for the city of Northport, joining us tonight to give us some insight. Now, ladies, what is the biggest challenge you face on the job? Misty or Mandy, either of you can answer that if you'd like.
That's a tough question.
Yeah, it's very tough.
Every phone call is a challenge.
Okay.
You not knowing what's on the other end of the line.
And I think that's probably what's kept me in this profession for so long, is that fact.
Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about the importance of using 911 properly. In the break, we were talking about some of the incidents that you have to go through and some of the calls that aren't necessarily emergencies. So what are the proper ways of using 911?
Someone improperly using it's going to tie up that dispatcher, which isn't going to allow that dispatcher to, then take the next emergency. I would say, only use it if you feel it's a life or death situation. I think we do need to start, though, when children are young, with the parents and in schools, to kind of teach them what is an emergency and what isn't. Using 911 for in-progress calls will assist in how quickly and accurately police are able to respond. Our effectiveness depends on that. It depends on if we make it there in time for a possible arrest or detention of a suspect. So
certainly. And Misty, when is a true time that you should be calling 911? Can you give us some examples?
In-progress calls.
Okay.
Fire calls, medical calls, accidents with injuries. Those are all calls that need a quick response. So if you're looking for someone to respond, you're going to call 911 for that. A lot of citizens call administrative lines with that as well, but we're trained to ask the proper questions no matter which line they call.
And what are some of those proper questions that you are trained to ask when it comes in for a call like that?
Most importantly would be location.
Okay, right.
And then tell me exactly what's going on. And a lot of times you will get information that doesn't pertain to this particular call. So you kind of have to keep your caller focused on what's going on at this moment in time.
And speaking of these calls, the proper way and the important calls and the true time to call 911, what are some of the craziest calls that you've had come in? Mandy, if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Daily, I would say we get crazy calls. They say if we could write a book, it would be full of that kind of stuff. But the ones that really get me are the children callers. They're not equipped like adults are, with that type of thing. So those really kind of hit home for me when we get the children callers, and they're essentially needing our assistance.
And what kind of efforts, Misty, do you guys make for children? Do you guys go out to schools and talk with these students about what is the proper way to call 911 so they're not, I remember when I was younger, I had friends who thought it'd be funny to maybe call 911, which obviously is not the case, and I'm sure you've had that situation happen. But do you educate the students to let them know what the proper protocol is for that?
We definitely need to have more education on that. Right now, yearly, we have National Night Out, and a lot of kids come by, especially if you're passing out free items, they like to come by and talk. And you do educational on that. And anytime an officer goes out to a call that is child involved, they'll sit and talk to them, explain to them when to call 911, when not to.
And what about education when it comes to adults and seniors, Mandy?
I mean, there's really no education out there. The only education that they might get is, you know, by experience from calling 911 or calling the non-emergency line.
Would either of you hope to see more education for adults and seniors who may not understand the complete use of how to properly use 911?
Absolutely.
Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about what kind of calls hinder the process for you guys. I know there's all sorts of you know, hoops and jumps you have to hurdle for these 911 calls. What is the kind of calls that are kind of slowing you down?
The basic non-emergency type calls, dogs barking, noise complaints, scam calls, things like that. Those kind of really bog us down, which, you know, we take into consideration that all of the calls that come into the call center are important, but not necessarily requiring emergency services.
Okay, and Misty, I have an example of a Sacramento man who called cops on a passenger who was eating a burrito on a train. There was a sign that said no eating on the train, but he still called. How do you guys handle that kind of situation? What would be the conversation you would have with that caller?
Well, all calls are handled professionally.
Okay.
Whether we think that's an emergency or not, we would handle it and make that person feel like they did the right thing by calling. We might end it saying, next time you don't have an emergency, call this number. But we would gather the information. Evidently someone's breaking the law and he feels he has to, you know, call and turn them in. But other than that, I mean, it is those type of calls.
Right.
But 911 is an easier number to remember than the local jurisdiction on a train when you don't know really where you are. And if they don't have it properly posted of who to notify, he probably thought he was doing the right thing.
Certainly. Well, Sarasota County receives about 1,800 calls per day, and how many of those are going to Northport for you all? Do you guys know the estimate maybe of a number for that?
I know in 2017 we took 553,000 calls, but those are just calls coming in, whether they're 911, non-emergency, or radio type calls. In an average year, I would say 20,000 calls for service. So you can kind of see how many calls that are actually coming in that are actually calls for service.
Certainly. And Misty, by having these phony calls that come in, is it taking away from true emergencies, and how does that affect response times for officers for you all in Northport?
Well, I mean, it does hinder that. At Northport, you have one dispatcher answering 911 calls. So if you have an emergency call coming in and someone's calling with a non-emergency call, that call is not getting answered in a timely manner, or one that we would consider a timely manner. So we would disconnect and you talk to those. It's hard because people don't have an understanding of exactly how many dispatchers are in a room at one time, how many 911 calls are coming in. So by educating the public on what calls are not 911 calls.
What are those numbers for how many dispatchers are typically in a room versus how many calls are coming in? Is that an even number, or is it a large number for each dispatcher?
In our comm center, there's anywhere from 2 to 4 operators there at a time. So a lot of times, you know, we do have to put callers on hold if they don't have an emergency. But you know, with the earlier question, we are taught to prioritize. So no matter what kind of call comes in on what line, we take into consideration what's going on in that call and prioritize that to know which call will get an officer quicker than another call.
Okay, and what do you guys do to work with other counties or cities? I know you said you work hand in hand with Sarasota County, but what about Manatee County or perhaps Charlotte County a little south of you? How does that work with you guys?
I mean, they're all in the same region. We work together, you could say, on a daily basis. You know, where we get BOLOs, where, you know, Manatee County is looking for, say, a stolen vehicle. So we know to be on the lookout. So in our region, we, you know, are pretty much work together every day. We might not talk to another dispatcher from that agency every day, but we definitely get bolos and things like that.
Okay, and then what would you say to our viewers? Of course, better safe than sorry when it comes to these 911 calls. What would you say to them?
I hate the saying better safe than sorry, but I would say yes, it's better on the safe side if you don't know if you have an emergency or not to dial 911. We never want to deter someone from calling police. You know, and as Misty had stated earlier, you know, it's not always posted what number you're supposed to call if it's a non-emergency. I know we have smartphones now, so we can look up those types of things, but sometimes people feel as if time is of the essence.
And Misty, what are some other resources that people can call other than 911? Are there any other non-emergency hotline numbers, any resources online? I know we saw text 911, you can do that as well.
You can. If you text 911, of course, you're getting
Right.
Sarasota County Sheriff's Office first.
Okay.
And then, yeah, they are a public safety answering point.
Okay.
So anytime someone calls 911, that's where it's routed first. But our administrative lines for general questions is 429-7300. And they would press 1 for police dispatch. A lot of citizens don't realize that pressing 1 for police, even just to ask a question, they don't understand that it's a dispatcher that's able to answer that question for them. And of course, the numbers that they gave in this segment before leading up that Sarasota gave is good, because we don't have a general hotline for questions in Northport. You would literally just call the police department and we would be able to answer those questions.
All
So
right.
the county's number is a good number as well.
Okay, well ladies, thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. We'd like to thank our guests, Misty Elmore and Mandy Lorenz, both 911 Center supervisors in the city of Northport. When we return, we'll be joined by ABC7's consumer watchdog, Jerry Zivick, to talk about the use of Social Security benefits. Stay with us.